Hi, this is Gabriel from the Cayman Islands. Today I want to speak about St. Peter and St. Paul. This was a bromance that never was. Now, June 29th, it will mark an important celebration in Christendom, the feasts of St. Peter and St. Paul. Novelists, poets, painters, and filmmakers are fully aware of how captivating stories of bromance can be. Think about Batman and Robin, or Asterix and Obelix, or Starsky and Hutch, or real-life characters like Obama and Joe Biden, and so on. Now, these duos have rough times and stray relationships at various points, but eventually they happily reconcile and join efforts to do something great, each one in his own capacity. Now, naturally enough, this is the way Christianity envisions the relationship between Peter and Paul. As imagined by countless painters, Peter has the keys and Paul has the sword. Peter is a simple fisherman, whereas Paul is a sophisticated urbanite. But ultimately, they complement each other, all in the happy service of the faith. Well, actually, no. Peter and Paul's relationship was probably far more tumultuous. And from the very moment that the deeds of both characters were narrated in the biblical book of Acts of the Apostles, there has been an attempt to dissimulate the strains and to come up with some form of a public relations campaign in order to present a happy church that was consolidated from the beginning with no divisions affecting its integrity. Paul, who was an apostle that never met Jesus, well, he went to meet Peter and James, who was Jesus' brother. He went to meet them on a first visit to Jerusalem. Now, one may presume that Peter and James did not trust this mysterious man who suddenly proclaims himself as an apostle. And Jesus' followers, who were Jews, they lived by Moses' law. But Paul had the idea that Jesus' message must reach the Gentiles, and that the Gentiles must not submit to circumcision and other tortuous Jewish rituals. Now, this must have caused some offense to the original followers of Jesus, because Jesus had clearly said that he had not come to abolish the law, but rather to fulfill it. Apparently, Paul wanted to resolve this issue in Jerusalem, and so he went to meet the original leaders of the movement, Peter and James. So they met, and apparently they reached an agreement that was sealed with a handshake. So the Gentiles, they would be accepted and they wouldn't have to be circumcised. So the agreement was that Peter and James would preach to the Jews and Paul would preach to the Gentiles. So both Paul, in his own account of Galatians and Acts account, confirm this version. However, later on, Paul, again in Galatians, he narrates something that is truly astonishing. In that same chapter where he narrates all this, Paul says that while he was in Antioch, Peter ate with Gentiles. But when delegates sent by James arrived, Peter distanced himself from the Gentiles, fearing James' delegates. Upon seeing that behavior, Paul publicly reprehended Peter. Now, we may wonder, how on earth did this happen? Well, from the Gospels account, we know that Peter was someone weak in character. And surely not everything that is detailed about Peter in the Gospels is true, but they do present an accurate appraisal of his personality. So at first, Peter would have had no problem accepting the terms of the original meeting in Jerusalem. But then, when the more hardcore Jewish delegates sent by James arrive in Antioch, Peter changes his mind. My guess is that at the meeting in Jerusalem, James was not very serious. I think it must not have been a very formal gathering. Today, the church tradition calls it the Council of Jerusalem, but I figure it was just a few guys sitting under the shade of a tree, talking informally. And whatever agreement was reached was only confirmed by a mere handshake. Maybe James just went along with Paul's enthusiasm of preaching to the Gentiles, but he did not really have the intent to commit to it. After all, at the time of the meeting, there was a massive famine in Jerusalem. And apparently one of the terms of the agreement would be that Paul could preach to the Gentiles as long as he would help out with the poor of Jerusalem. Now, Paul himself confirms this in Galatians. In other words, it seems to me that James was willing to tolerate Paul's eccentric plan, but only with the intention of getting Paul to provide monetary relief for the impoverished people of Judea. I understand James' approach. I mean, perhaps out of concern for his Judean brethren, James was willing to engage in this kind of scam. Or perhaps James and Paul misunderstood each other in that meeting, and they seemed to agree on something that when in fact they did not. And this is rather common in human interactions, right? Now, after that confrontation in Antioch, it seems that Paul was never again on happy terms with either Peter or James. The book of Acts narrates that in Paul's visit to Jerusalem, James, who was ever mindful of Moses' law, he exhorted Paul to embrace a Nazirite vow in the temple. In the midst of some confusion, some Jews tried to kill Paul, and Roman soldiers went over and rescued him. Now, strangely, James did not do anything to help Paul. This is very strange. But again, my guess is that neither James nor Peter, who by that time had already left Jerusalem, neither one of them thought much of Paul. Maybe they would not have minded if he were arrested and taken away. Now, the book of Acts tries to solve this quarrel and presents Paul, Peter, and James as great friends that, at the end of the day, solve these minor conflicts. Acts very conveniently omits any reference to the heated exchange of words in Antioch. In fact, Acts presents their narrative as if Peter was from the very start willing to preach to Gentiles. And the Roman centurion Cornelius would have been his first convert, right? But it presents it as if there had never been a big dispute on this issue. Now, clearly, as scholars know all too well, whoever wrote Acts, that person had an axe to grind. A major point in this author's agenda was to present the early Christian movement as one unified family. And I think we should know better, because in a variety of Paul's authentic writings, especially 2 Corinthians, he is extremely resentful against what appears to be James' leadership, and this beef never came to a happy resolution. Now, after Acts' initial attempt at spin doctrine, later Christian tradition tried to expand the Peter and Paul bromance even further. By the late 2nd century, the city of Rome was beginning to displace in ecclesial importance the other great centers of Christianity, such as Antioch or Alexandria or Jerusalem. And so the bromance of Peter and Paul was taken as a trope to highlight Rome's central place. Now, around that time, Irenaeus of Lyon was claiming that Peter and Paul were the founders of the church in Rome. And ever since, Christian imagination has been very fecund in picturing the two friends coming together to convert the Gentiles in the empire's capital and eventually suffering together Nero's persecution. Now, as far as we know, Peter may or may not have ended up in Rome. This is a matter of dispute. The only real source that attests to this is Clement, who's a Christian author who wrote in the 90s. The tradition that he was martyred seems to have some plausibility, and it is somewhat hinted at the end of the Gospel of John, and it also seems to be attested by the apocryphal Acts of Peter, although, as with pretty much all apocryphal Christian texts, the historical reliability of this source is very shaky. Now, as for Paul, the book of Acts also narrates that he wound up in Rome, though it doesn't make any mention of martyrdom. Clement does hint that, very much like Peter, Paul was martyred, and this is confirmed by additional later Christian authors, such as Ignatius of Antioch. So at least in that regard, Christian tradition may have had it right. But Peter and Paul were certainly not the founders of the Christian church in Rome. In fact, there were already Christians there when Paul wrote the famous epistle to them, before he ever went to Rome for the first time. It would even seem that Peter and Paul did not really interact in Rome at all. When Paul wrote to the Romans, he sent greetings to many people, but he never mentioned Peter. So I think this would indicate that either Peter was never there, or perhaps more likely, that Paul did not care about Peter, and a unified leadership of the Christian community in Rome came much later. In fact, we know from other pieces of evidence, for instance, a book known as the Shepherd of Hermas, that as late as the mid-2nd century of the Common Era, there were many bishops in Rome, not just one. So, unlike the cults of paganism that it eventually came to replace, Christianity prides itself on being based on real stories with real characters. And indeed, as opposed to, say, Achilles or Patroclus, and this pair, it's actually more homoerotic, not just romantic. But anyway, and we can never be sure that they existed. And when it comes to Peter and Paul, we're actually on firmer historical ground. Yet, Christianity is a more complicated religion because in its traditions, fact and fiction intermingle, and it is not always easy to determine which is which. I would say that at least for the case of Peter and Paul, we know that despite all those magnificent paintings and the gorgeous churches that have been built in their name, this is a bromance that never was.